What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Thanks so much for tuning into today's video. Today we're going to look at St. Paul's Chapel in New York City. I'm excited about this one. This is a extremely historic church, which is always fun for me when I can nerd out about the history of some of these extremely old buildings. But this church also has a connection to the American Revolution and just the very early, very early American history, which I think is very cool. So this church building is actually the oldest church building in all of New York City, which I think is pretty notable when you just consider how historic that city is. And it's located on Broadway, which is obviously a very famous street in New York City and Lower Manhattan. It's a few blocks away from Trinity Church, which we are going to talk about next week. This chapel, like I said, it's the oldest one. It was opened in 1766, which goes back a very long way, which I think is awesome. And this chapel was actually built as an extension of Trinity Church, which is a few blocks down the street. As the population grew and just the congregation grew in size, they established this chapel, which is a lot smaller in size, but was just made so that people that lived closer to this one could kind of more easily access it. So, Trinity Church is like a very old, famous Episcopal church. And again, we'll talk about it more next week, but this just opened kind of as an extension, which is very cool to me. Again, this church has some notable history. So what I think is awesome about it is this church is where George Washington worshiped while he was president in New York City, which is just so cool to me. So New York was the first capital of the U.S. Not to get down too nerdy of a tangent about this, but the Continental Congress, specifically the Second Continental Congress, and then the Congress of the Confederation that was established with the Articles of Confederation as kind of the unifying constitution before our U.S. Constitution was established. The capital kind of rotated. Sometimes it was voluntarily, they would kind of move it around. Other times it was forced based on like conflict with, like a militia was needed and a protest or a militia was gathering against them and there wasn't like support to defend the actual, representatives that were meeting at that particular building. So for that reason, sometimes they had to forcibly flee. But anyway, the Confederation Congress had the most recent spot before the Constitution was ratified was New York City. And I believe that was the longest, the place where they were situated the longest. So when George Washington was inaugurated as the first president, and he served in Federal Hall, it's on Wall Street. I believe the original building, I'm not 100% certain, but I think the original building had to be rebuilt in some way, but you can still see where the building is. There's a statue of George Washington there, and it's famous for being on Wall Street. So both Trinity Church and thus St. Paul's Chapel were very close proximity to there. So this is where he worshiped, which I think is so cool to think about. He also is said on his inauguration day in 1789, after the inauguration, he went and attended church services at St. Paul's Chapel. Again, I've mentioned this before on the channel, but there's something about when a physical space, to me, the history can transcend time. It's like when you're at a particular place and such notable events or people or whatever it is kind of took place there, I think that always sticks with it, which I think is just incredibly cool to me to think that George Washington was in that very space, even though the space can look different with renovations and things like that over time. So the church is famous for that reason, obviously for being so old and going back that far. It's also a church that's known for its resiliency in, in the sense of the physical space. So when the American Revolution was, when the war was happening, there was what's called the Great Fire of 1776 in Lower Manhattan. after kind of the Battle of Long Island, a lot of the residents had to flee, that lived there, and the British occupied the city for a time. And it's kind of unclear how the fire started or where specifically it started, but it ended up ravaging like a lot of the infrastructure and buildings that were there at the time. But St. Paul's endured and actually was not destroyed by it, which was kind of a rare thing. Actually, Trinity Church, and we'll talk about it next week too, but Trinity Church, the actual building, was destroyed and had to be rebuilt. So St. Paul's was able to endure that, which kind of became the first part of that history of resiliency. And then second, it's known it adopted the moniker the little chapel that stood after 9/11 because this church is less than 100 yards away from where the World Trade Center complex is. And you'll be able to see in the video just the One World Trade Center building now just like towers over the church. And I think it's, again, a very cool juxtaposition of the two very different types of buildings. One extremely old, one extremely modern. But in any case, it became famous for that because as the towers collapsed and fell, and we talked about this some on the episode last week of the St. Nicholas Shrine, but so much of the debris that fell, like a lot of other buildings, were just horribly damaged and everything by it, even outside of the World Trade Center complex. But famously, this chapel stood with very little damage at all. There was a large sycamore tree that stood kind of between where the Trade Center was and the actual chapel that kind of like took a lot of the the brunt of the debris and the damage and everything. So that's part of the reason why it stood. But when you kind of add those two things together and think about like the hundreds of years of history between, there's just something that's very special about a building that can kind of withstand and endure that much time, which is just so cool. So that's kind of just like a brief little bit of the history. So let's go check out the footage from the church, and then stay tuned after for some just more insight and more history on it. All right, so I hope you enjoyed getting to see the footage of this church. You know, it's one of those that the building is so old. It's like, as far as the actual interior of the church is concerned, there's not like a ton to write home about. But what I think is worth noting is the architecture style is late Georgian architecture, which is known for coming from Britain and spread throughout the British Empire, which makes sense that it would eventually spread to the colonies in America. So it's that style, which very, very simple interiors is kind of what it's known for. It's known for having just like a larger nave section of the church, which this one certainly does. The entryway leads straight into it, and it's big, it's vast. The ceilings are very tall. They're known also for having galleries, which this one also does, which I think is pretty cool. And then from an exterior perspective, like the front porch that you could see the big columns is another kind of famous thing, and the symmetry from the front of the building from that perspective, and kind of the big like outlier from that would be like a big bell tower or spire or something, which this church obviously has. Churches are not like the only thing specific to this architecture style at the time. There's just like other meeting places, courthouses, mansions, some like other ones that you could see examples of from the early times in the U.S. So I think that's just worth noting. That architecture style would eventually become what colonial style is. So as America's adopting its own identity after the Revolution and after the British occupation ends, that kind of stuff will develop. What is cool though, and why I think this is worth visiting, is just some of the other kind of pieces of history and kind of tributes that are at the church. So on the porch, kind of as you're about to enter, there's a memorial to General Richard Montgomery. This is so cool to me. He was a general for the Continental Army. He has a pretty interesting history, some of which is just kind of out of the scope of this channel. But he was actually killed during the attempted invasion of Quebec in late 1775. So again, early part of the Revolutionary War. He was under Major General Philip Schuyler of Alexander Hamilton fame. He was Hamilton's father-in-law, and infamously Benedict Arnold, or what became the infamous Benedict Arnold, was also a part of this invasion, which is interesting. But in any case, he was killed, and this memorial was made for him. This is believed to be the very first memorial that was commissioned by the Continental Congress, which is extremely cool. So it goes back to January 1776, and it's said that Benjamin Franklin actually oversaw the construction of the actual memorial while he was in France as ambassador there. So that's pretty awesome to me. And his remains they were moved there after the memorial was kind of established and everything. So that's a pretty awesome piece of the history that you can see just by seeing the exterior portion of the church. And then, like I mentioned, that George Washington worshipped here. So there's that amazing oil painting of the seal. I think it's one of the earliest depictions of the seal, and I forget the date, but it goes back like to 1780 or something. It's extremely old, which is cool. And that painting was located right over George Washington's pew where he worshipped on a consistent basis. So obviously it's moved around, but they still have it in there, which I think is cool and worth noting. And there's some other plaques that commemorate Washington and his inauguration and other things like that. You'll see Alexander Hamilton's name on one of them. One thing that I think is worth noting is that he was in the very early stage, part of a militia of the Continental Army that was kind of stationed in Lower Manhattan, and his regiment actually would do like drills in the yard of the chapel, which I think is also pretty notable. And then some of the connections to 9/11. So the chapel kind of became like a staging ground for first responders who were, searching for, or trying to attempt rescues amongst all the debris and everything in Ground Zero. And this became, because it's close by, kind of like a refuge spot where they could come take naps. There would be volunteers that would come offer food and water for them and everything. And so that the memorial pew, which I think is notable, that's in there, kind of represents that. And you can see kind of like the wear and tear on it just from all the usage, and seeing the kind of the picture they have there, just knowing that there were all kinds of letters from loved ones, notes, and everything, just about everything that was going on. Like, just kind of embodies the nature of the community and how they came together after that horrible tragedy. And then there's some other things. There's like the Iron Cross, and some other items that were kind of forged from some steel, the remains of the towers. So from that perspective too, I think this church is worth seeing for the history alone, but for kind of those other memorial aspects of 9/11, I think it's seeing those things in there were very cool as well. I don't really think there's a ton else to highlight from the interior of the church. Again, it's very basic in its construction, I would say. I did like the chandeliers. I thought those were cool, and the organ is of course impressive, but otherwise it's kind of just that standard architectural style that we discussed. The other thing to note is that there's a graveyard on the kind of backside of the church. I actually didn't get around to it in time because it was right at dusk when we were getting to the church, and that's when they close. But if you're able to go around there's some other kind of very old tombstones and things like that, and that's where I think it's called the Hope Bell is located. That's where every 9/11 at exactly maybe 8:46, when the North Tower was first hit, they ring the bell, and it's kind of like in a tribute to firefighters and other first responders. So that bell is there. I wasn't able to see it this time. I have seen it before. It's very cool. But again, that's there if you're able to kind of have some time to explore around the church. So this was a very fun church to see and to research. There's just so much that's wrapped up in it. I mean, when you think back to how far, like 250 years over that, that building has been there, and all that just all the history that's encompassing in that, I think is amazing. So hope you enjoyed getting to see it. We'll be back next week. We'll talk more about Trinity Church, which is kind of it'll be like a sister episode to this one. So thank you so much for tuning in, and until next time, keep looking up.